The warm glow of the afternoon sun casts long golden streaks across the dark oak floors, giving the room a serene, almost nostalgic feel. Mary stands at the center of it all, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a dust rag in one hand. Her eyes scan the room with the precision of someone who's done this routine 1,000 times before. She adjusts the angle of a leather-bound book on the shelf, wipes a faint layer of dust from a row of framed family photos, and lets out a small sigh. It's the kind of exhale that suggests contentment, or maybe quiet fatigue. 35 years of marriage does that to a person. Her gaze settles on the mahogany desk, Ronald's desk. The air shifts slightly, a subtle change in her posture. Her eyes narrow as she spots a tangle of charging cords snaking their way out from behind a stack of unopened mail. He never keeps this desk tidy. A flicker of annoyance crosses her face as she moves toward it, nudging the mail aside. That's when she sees it. A small silver USB drive, plain, unmarked, but undeniably out of place. It lies at an odd angle near the edge of the desk, as if it had been set down in a hurry and forgotten. She tilts her head, her fingers pausing mid-swipe with the rag. Her eyes dart to the hallway, listening. The house is silent, except for the faint tick of the clock. Her gaze shifts back to the USB. What is this doing here? With slow, deliberate movements, she picks it up between her fingers, turning it over like a detective examining evidence. She glances toward the door again, her breath shallow. Ronald isn't home. He'd said he was running errands, just like every other Thursday afternoon. Her eyes flick to the laptop on the desk. It sits open, the screen black, waiting. Her thumb traces over the USB drive's smooth surface, as if debating her next move. But curiosity pulls her forward. She slips the USB into the port, and the laptop screen comes to life with a quiet ping. Her fingers hover over the trackpad, unsure for just a moment, but only for a moment. Click. The folder that pops up is titled Retirement Plans. Her brow furrows. She knows all about their retirement plans. She'd been a part of every discussion, every financial meeting with Greg, their financial planner. So why would Ronald need a separate folder for it? Her breath catches in her throat as she opens it. File after file floods the screen, each one named with dates and obscure banking terms she doesn't fully understand. But one name stands out like a flashing warning light. Cayman Offshore Statements. Her heart thuds in her chest. Cayman. Her fingers move on their own now, clicking the file open. Rows of numbers appear, balances, deposits, transfers. Her eyes scan them, her breath coming quicker with every line. Her face, framed by the soft glow of the screen, shifts from confusion to realization, and then to something far darker. There it is. A deposit for $75,000 just last month. Her jaw tightens. A name appears next to the transaction, recipient Ruth Holdings. Her heart stops. Ruth? The name echoes in her mind like a bell tolling in an empty cathedral. She sits back in the chair, her fingers gripping the armrests like a lifeline. Her eyes stay glued to the screen as she scrolls through more deposits, transfers, and withdrawals. Each one hits her like a slap to the face. $20,000 here, $15,000 there. Money from their joint retirement account, money she thought was for their future. The weight of it crashes down on her shoulders, heavier than anything she's felt in years. Her breathing becomes uneven, shallow, like she can't quite catch enough air. Her eyes sting, but she refuses to blink. If she blinks, the tears will fall, and she's not ready for that. Not yet. Her hand moves to her mouth, as if to muffle a scream that never comes. Her eyes flicker to the framed photo on the edge of the desk. It's a photo from their 25th wedding anniversary, her in a pale blue dress, Ronald in a sharp gray suit, their hands clasped together, smiling as if they'd won at life. For 35 years she had believed that smile. Her fingers, slick with sweat, tremble as she reaches for the frame. For a second it seems like she's going to straighten it, but her grip tightens. Her lips press into a thin line. Her knuckles whiten as she clutches the frame in Sirac. She slams it against the desk, the sound of shattering glass filling the air. Shards scatter like jagged diamonds. a perfect metaphor for the broken reality now laying bare before her. Her breathing is shallow now, rapid. Her eyes dart to the mess of broken glass on the desk, then to her hands. She's breathing too fast. Calm down, Mary. Calm down. She presses her palms flat against the desk, fingers splayed wide, steadying herself. She closes her eyes, inhales deeply, holds it, then exhales slowly. Her face hardens as she opens her eyes once more. The panic is gone. Her eyes are dry. She reaches for the USB, yanks it from the laptop, and slips it into the back pocket of her jeans with practiced calm. The front door creaks open. Her head snaps toward the sound. Her eyes narrow, sharp and alert. She moves quickly, swiping the broken glass into the palm of her hand. She drops the shards into the trash bin under the desk with a faint clatter. Her eyes flick back to the laptop. She clicks out of the file, closing it just as Ronald's voice echoes down the hallway. "Mary, you home?" Her heart doesn't race this time. Her breathing is steady. The faint hint of a smile curls at the corner of her lips. Not a kind smile, not anymore. "I'm in here, honey," she calls, her voice light, effortless, like she hasn't just seen her entire world collapse. She wipes her hands on the front of her jeans, concealing the USB in her back pocket with a small, careful shift of her hips. Her eyes track the door as his footsteps grow louder. Her face is calm now, too calm. The door opens. Ronald walks in, jingling his car keys in his hand. He smiles like everything is normal. "I thought I'd grab some lunch with you," he says with that same old grin, the one she used to believe in. Mary tilts her head slightly, studying him as if seeing him for the very first time. Her smile is faint, controlled. "That sounds nice," she replies. Her voice is even, her eyes steady. But her gaze lingers on him just a beat too long. She watches him as if he's a bug she's about to trap under a glass. "Would you grab lunch with Ronald if you just discovered what Mary saw? Let me know in the comment section before we move ahead in with the story." Flashback to Mary and Ronald's 35th wedding anniversary. A soft glow of candlelight flickers against cream-colored walls as the warm murmur of laughter and conversation fills the air. The low hum of jazz music drifts lazily in the background, mixing with the gentle clinking of wine glasses and the scrape of silverware on porcelain plates. The dining room is full of life, family, friends, and the undeniable warmth of celebration. At the head of a long, rustic wooden table sit Mary and Ronald, side by side like king and queen presiding over their kingdom. 35 years together. That's what tonight is about. 35 years of love, compromise, and sacrifice. Mary looks radiant in a red dress that hugs her figure just right. Her black hair, styled in soft waves, frames her face with a quiet elegance. Her smile is genuine as she gazes out at her family and friends, eyes shining with gratitude. Laughter ripples through the air, and she chuckles softly, soaking in the moment. This is what she's worked for, what they've worked for. She glances at Ronald and her smile widens. Ronald, dashing in his sharp navy blue suit, raises his glass with a signature grin, the grin that once made her heart race. To 35 years of love, laughter, and partnership, he declares, his deep, commanding voice cutting through the hum of conversation. 35 more. Someone shouts from down the table, and laughter erupts. Glasses clink, and Ronald looks around the room like a man who owns it all. Mary gazes at him, her heart full, her eyes soft. Her fingers brush lightly over his hand on the table. "Still my Ronald," she thinks to herself. "Through all the years, still mine." But then something changes. A flicker of blue light glows faintly from his pocket. Her gaze sharpens. It's his phone. He glances down, quick and subtle, just a heartbeat too fast. His smile stays in place, but she sees it now. The slight shift in his eyes, the small, almost imperceptible movement of his hand as it presses against the side of his pocket, silencing the alert. Her eyes narrow. "Everything okay?" she asks. Her voice is soft as silk. Ronald's head snaps up, his grin still fixed in place. Yeah, just a work email," he says with a small shrug. He glances at her, flashing that familiar grin. Greg's probably sending me another update on those retirement numbers. Mary nods slowly, eyes on him longer than necessary. Greg's working pretty late, she says, her tone light, almost playful. Yeah, he's always on it, Ronald replies too quickly. He raises his glass, taking a long, slow sip. He doesn't meet her eyes. Mary's smile stays in place, but it doesn't quite reach her eyes anymore. She lifts her own glass to her lips, her gaze never leaving him. The light flickers again from his pocket, just for a second, before going dark. The faint hiss of a steaming espresso machine cuts through the soft jazz music playing inside the chic little cafe on the corner of Main Street. Morning light filters through large glass windows, casting long, golden streaks across polished wooden floors. Conversations hum quietly in the background, the sounds of clinking spoons and soft laughter weaving in and out of the melody of the cafe. At a small table by the window sits Ruth. She's striking. Auburn hair pulled into a sleek, no-nonsense ponytail. Her sharp red blazer draped over her chair. One leg crossed over the other, her black stiletto heel tapping the air in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Her phone sits on the table, screen up. It buzzes once. Her eyes flick down, her lips curling slowly into a knowing smile. The message appears briefly. Tomorrow at 3. Same spot. Her smile sharpens, slow and calculated. She types a quick reply with one hand, her nails tapping softly against the glass screen. Always. Her gaze drifts to the world beyond the window, her eyes distant but focused, like she's watching something the rest of the world can't see. She takes a slow sip of her cappuccino, the foam brushing her red lips. Her eyes lower back to the phone. She stirs her coffee with a silver spoon, watching the milk swirl into rich brown. The tapping of her heel continues, slow, steady, deliberate. Mary and Ronald are in Greg's office. The sterile chill of an air-conditioned office hums softly in the background. White walls, sleek black furniture, and large glass windows create a crisp, professional atmosphere. Greg sits behind a mahogany desk, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He flips through a neatly bound financial report, his gold watch glinting in the overhead light. Everything looks solid, Greg says, tapping the paper in front of him. His voice is calm, steady, reassuring. His eyes lift to Ronald and Mary, seated across from him. No surprises, no risks. Just steady growth from here on out. Ronald nods, barely paying attention. He's scrolling on his phone under the table. Mary shifts in her seat. And the joint account. Everything's still connected to both of us, right? Her eyes are on Greg, but her ears are on Ronald. Of course, Greg says, leaning back in his chair. Everything's transparent, no hidden fees. We're in complete control here. Good, Mary says, her voice steady but firm. She glances at Ronald, eyes narrowing just a bit as she notices his thumb swipe up on his phone. He's texting. She doesn't say anything. Not yet. She folds her hands neatly in her lap, her eyes flicking to Greg. Can you send me the latest statements? She asks. I'd like to review them myself this weekend. Ronald's eyes flick up just for a second. Greg nods. Of course, Mary. I'll send them tonight. Perfect, she says, smiling at Greg, but her gaze stays on Ronald just a moment too long. He doesn't notice. It's late on Tuesday night. The soft glow of a single lamp casts golden light across the living room, creating long shadows that stretch across the hardwood floor. Mary sits curled up on the couch, a knitted throw blanket draped over her legs. Her knitting needles click softly, rhythmic and steady, the only sound in the quiet house. Her eyes stay fixed on the yarn in her hands, but her mind is elsewhere. The clock on the wall reads 11:43 p.m. Her phone buzzes on the coffee table. She picks it up, her face lit briefly by the cold blue glow of the screen. Running late. Don't wait up. Her fingers hover over the reply button. Her gaze hardens. Slowly, she sets the phone back down on the table, screen side down, her knitting needle still for a moment. The morning light streamed softly through the kitchen window, catching on the glass vase of fresh tulips Mary had placed on the counter just the day before. The air smelled faintly of fresh brewed coffee and lemon-scented countertop cleaner. Mary stood by the kitchen sink, rinsing out a coffee cup, her fingers moving slowly under the warm water, her mind elsewhere. It had been one of those restless nights where sleep felt like a distant concept. She'd lain in bed beside Ronald, his soft snoring filling the room, her eyes fixed on the ceiling in the dark. Something was off. She knew it. She could feel it. The way his phone seemed to buzz more often at night. The way he'd started taking his calls outside. The way he always had a ready excuse, work old friends, a quick run to the store. She'd brushed it off at first, the way you brush away a fly that won't leave you alone. But now, that fly had become a hornet, buzzing louder, more insistent. This morning it all felt heavier. Her mind, normally so sharp and clear, felt foggy. Her eyes drifted toward the coat rack by the front door. Ronald's leather jacket hung neatly on the hook, his keys dangling from the pocket, jingling faintly with each gust of air from the vent above. Her hand stilled under the stream of water. Check it. The thought wasn't loud, but it was persistent. She turned off the faucet, dried her hands on a kitchen towel, and walked slowly toward the coat. Her steps were quiet, her breath shallow, like a predator stalking prey. Her eyes flicked to the hallway, listening for any sign of him. The only sound was the faint hum of the fridge. Her fingers slipped into the jacket pocket. Loose change. A mint wrapper. Then, something crisper. Paper. She pinched it between her fingers and pulled it out. A receipt. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the small, blocky print. Monarch Suites Hotel, Nassau, Bahamas. Check-in, 2 nights, Ocean View Suite. Amount, $1,295.60. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers tightened on the receipt, creasing it slightly. She read it again, slower this time, as if the words might somehow change if she looked long enough. But they didn't. Bahamas. They'd never been to the Bahamas. She would have remembered that. They talked about it once, years ago, back when vacations were something they actually planned together. But this? No, this wasn't them. This wasn't her. Her lips pressed into a tight, thin line. She folded the receipt neatly, too neatly, and slipped it back into his jacket pocket, exactly as she'd found it. Her hands felt steady, but her heart wasn't. It thudded like a warning drum in her chest. She didn't move for a moment, just stood there, staring at the coat, eyes distant but focused. This wasn't an accident. Her mind started to move faster now, like gears clicking into place. She turned and walked calmly back to the kitchen, her fingers trailing along the cool granite countertop. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, searching for something. Her phone. There, sitting at the edge of the counter. She snatched it up, her fingers tapping faster than usual as she unlocked it and opened their shared bank account app. The screen loaded slowly, the spinning wheel of waiting making her jaw clench. But when it did load, her breath caught again. A transaction. The same amount, $1,295.60. The same date as the receipt. He didn't even hide it. Her fingers hovered over the screen, tapping the View Details option. The screen refreshed. Hotel payment, Monarch Suites, Nassau, Bahamas. Her thumb hovered over the phone for a moment, frozen in place, before she backed out and closed the app. He's sloppy. He thinks I'm not paying attention. Her eyes stayed on the phone. Her heart rate slowed. Her breathing grew steady. Her mind, however, was anything but calm. She opened the browser on her phone, typed Monarch Suites Bahamas into the search bar, and clicked on the first link that popped up. The hotel's website loaded, and images of sprawling beach views and luxury infinity pools filled the screen. Couples smiled at each other in white linen clothing, laughing over wine at sunset. Her eyes narrowed as she scrolled. Her jaw tightened. Then a thought hit her. Ruth. She hadn't thought about Ruth in weeks. Just a name Ronald had mentioned once, an old colleague from back in the day, someone he'd reconnected with recently. A little too recently. Mary's fingers flew over the screen, searching the name on social media. Ruth Hollingsworth. She typed it slowly, methodically, her thumb pressing each key with precision. Search. The first result popped up. A profile. Her profile. Auburn hair, red lipstick, and sharp cheekbones. Mary stared at the photo. There you are. Her thumb tapped into the feed, scrolling through images of Ruth posing at various restaurants, boutiques, and beaches. Mary's eyes darted over every image, her breath coming in slow, controlled pulls. Then she saw it. A photo of Ruth in a sunlit cabana, a fresh coconut drink in her hand. Captioned, "Ocean views and new beginnings. Life's too short for regrets." The location tag read, "Monarch Suites, Nassau, Bahamas." Mary's heart stopped for just a moment. Her lips parted, her gaze locked on the image, as if it might disappear if she blinked. Her chest rose and fell steadily, her eyes hard focused. Slowly, her lips pressed into a thin, dangerous smile. "Got you." Her hand moved on its own, opening the photo app, taking a screenshot of Ruth's post, the caption, the date. Evidence. Her phone made the quiet click of a snapshot being taken. She saved it, then closed the app. Her next move was precise. She tapped into her contact list. Her finger hovered over one name, Greg. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment, her gaze steady, sharp. Her thumb pressed call. The phone rang twice before Greg answered. "Greg," she said, her voice calm, like she wasn't holding the pieces of her life together with sheer willpower. "I need to meet with you." "Just me?" "Not Ronald." "Is everything all right, Mary?" Greg asked, his voice filled with concern. "Not yet," she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the hallway where Ronald's coat still hung on the hook. "But it will be." Silence hung on the line for a moment before Greg's reply came through. "I can make time tomorrow morning." "Good," Mary said, her eyes like steel, her voice like a cold blade. "I've got a plan I want to run by you." She hung up the phone slowly, setting it on the counter. She didn't move right away, just stared at it for a moment, her thoughts silent but heavy. And then she walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the backyard, hands resting on the cool marble countertop. Her eyes stayed distant, her mind far ahead of the moment. No tears, no breakdown, no begging. Not this time. Her breath came slow and steady, her fingers drumming softly against the countertop in a slow, rhythmic pattern. She wasn't going to cry about it. She was going to outsmart him. The steady hum of Greg's office air conditioner fills the quiet space, blending with the soft rustle of papers being shuffled on the large mahogany desk. Sunlight filters through the blinds, casting thin, horizontal stripes of light and shadow across the room. The faint smell of leather and fresh coffee lingers in the air. Mary sits across from Greg, her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes are sharp, unwavering. There's no hesitation, no trace of doubt. She's not the same woman who stared at the hotel receipt with trembling hands. No, she's different now. Her gaze is hard, focused. "So, walk me through it one more time," she says, her voice calm but firm. "I want every detail right." Greg leans forward, adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose. His sleeves are rolled to his elbows, his tie slightly loosened, giving him the look of a man deep in strategy. He flips the top page of a crisp, bound folder and points to a set of mock financial reports. "We're selling him on exclusivity," Greg explains, tapping the page twice with his index finger. "Limited investment slots, high demand, only a select few clients get in. We give him just enough to feel like he's being let in on a secret." He glances up at her. "People like Ronald can't resist being part of something other people can't have." Mary leans forward, her lips curling into a small smile. "He always did love to feel special," she says, her tone carrying a sharp edge. Her eyes scan the document in front of her. Projected earnings, real estate portfolio, private buyer testimonials. It's all there, as polished and professional as any real investment opportunity she's ever seen. "This looks perfect," she says softly. "Almost too perfect." "That's the point," Greg replies with a grin. "He won't ask too many questions because he won't want to look like he doesn't understand it." Mary nods, her eyes still on the papers. Her fingers trace the edge of the folder slowly. "This is it," she thinks to herself. "This is how you take back control." She looks up at Greg, her eyes steady. Make sure the testimonials sound real, not too polished. People trust the flaws. "Already done," Greg replies, sliding a few pre-written client reviews toward her. Some of them mention small issues, but all of them end with big returns, just like a real review would. Mary's smile widens. "Good," she says, pushing herself up from the chair. She smooths her blouse and takes a slow breath and straightens her shoulders. Send me the final version by tomorrow. I'll make sure Ronald sees it. Greg raises an eyebrow. You're really going through with this, huh? Mary turns to face him fully, tilting her head just slightly. Her eyes are as sharp as glass. He took 35 years from me, Greg. I'm just taking back what's mine. Later that afternoon, Mary sits at the corner table of a small cafe. The aroma of roasted coffee beans fills the air, the faint chatter of customers blending into the soft background hum. Her hands are wrapped around a ceramic mug, fingers tapping softly against its sides as she stares at the door. The bell above the entrance jingles, and Mary's eyes snap toward it. Ruth walks in, wearing a sleek red coat and tall black boots. Her auburn hair is pulled into a high ponytail, and her sunglasses rest perched on top of her head. She moves with the kind of confidence that draws attention but doesn't beg for it. Heads turn as she walks in, but Ruth doesn't look at anyone. She walks straight toward Mary. I thought you'd never call, Ruth says, slipping into the seat across from her. Her lips curve into a smile, but it's guarded sharp. Mary leans back in her chair, eyes studying Ruth like she's a puzzle. Didn't think you'd actually show, she replies, raising an eyebrow. Ruth folds her hands on the table, her red nails tapping softly. Curiosity got the better of me, she says, tilting her head. You said you knew everything. I do, Mary says plainly, locking eyes with her Bahamas, the transfers, the long nights with work friends. I know it all, Ruth, and I know you're not as loyal to him as you want him to think. Ruth's lips press together in a tight line, her fingers still tapping. There's a long, heavy pause. Then she exhales, her shoulders relaxing. You're right, she says with a small shrug. Ronald thinks he's got me wrapped around his finger, but honestly, I'm tired of the games. Mary nods slowly, leaning forward now. Her voice drops lower, quieter. Then help me. Ruth raises an eyebrow. Help you do what? Help me ruin him, Mary says, her voice so cold it makes Ruth's eyes widen just slightly. For a moment, Ruth just stares at her, her lips parting like she's about to laugh. But then, slowly, her smile grows. A slow, dangerous grin. Now you're speaking my language, Ruth says, leaning forward. Tell me the plan. It starts small, subtle, calculated. Mary begins planting the idea in Ronald's mind over dinner one night. She cuts into her steak slowly, her tone casual, light. Greg mentioned a real estate opportunity, she says, as if it's an afterthought. One of those private investments. He says the returns are insane, but they only offer it to a few clients. Ronald raises an eyebrow, chewing his food a little slower. Private opportunity, huh? Mim, she says, taking a sip of her wine. But they're only letting in a few people. Not sure we'd qualify. She shrugs like it's nothing. Plant the seed. Water it just a little. 2 days later, she accidentally leaves an investment brochure from Greg's folder on the kitchen counter. She doesn't say a word about it. That night, Ronald picks it up, flipping through it as she pretends to fold laundry in the next room. Her eyes flick toward him as she sees him furrow his brow, reading the testimonials. Got you. Ruth plays her part, too. One evening, she casually texts him, ever think about growing your money while you sleep? Some people are making a killing with these private investments. Ronald's response is quick. What kind of investments? Ruth replies, real estate. Exclusive slots only. Not for everyone. It's all he needs to hear. His ego kicks in. His greed takes over. The next week, Ronald calls Greg. Heard about this real estate opportunity, he says with the casual arrogance of a man who thinks he's ahead of the curve. A want-in. Greg plays his role perfectly, pausing just long enough to sound hesitant. I don't know, Ronald. We've got limited spots. Ronald grins through the phone. Come on, Greg. You know I'm good for it. Greg's sigh is theatrical perfection. All right, he says reluctantly. But you'll have to move fast. It's filling up. I'll liquidate the funds this week, Ronald says, his voice filled with smug confidence. Greg hangs up the phone, leans back in his chair, and lets out a long breath. He taps his fingers on the desk, slowly, rhythmically. Across town, Mary sits on her living room couch, phone in hand. A text from Greg comes through. He's all in. She stares at it for a moment, her lips curling into a slow smile. No words. No celebration. Just quiet satisfaction. Her eyes flick to the framed wedding photo on the mantel, the one where Ronald's grin was just a little too wide. Not anymore, she thinks, leaning back into the couch. Her fingers tap lightly on the armrest. The countdown had begun. The faint chime of Greg's office clock echoed softly, each second falling like the steady drop of water into a bucket. The air smelled of leather, printer ink, and the faint tang of fresh coffee. Ronald sat at the edge of Greg's polished mahogany desk. His chair leaned back, just enough to give off the air of a man in control. His legs crossed, one foot bobbing to an unseen rhythm. His gold watch caught the afternoon sunlight, casting a sharp glint of light against the wall. Greg sat across from him, cool and collected, his fingers drumming lightly on a stack of crisp documents. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his eyes calm behind his reading glasses. "All right, Ronald," he said, sliding the papers forward. "This is it. Signature on the bottom of each page, and you're locked in. The funds will transfer directly, and you'll be listed as one of the exclusive investors." Ronald let out a satisfied huff, leaning forward and flipping through the pages like he actually intended to read them. His lips curled into a grin as he glanced at the financial projections, his eyes dancing over words like projected ROI, 120% in 18 months. He didn't need to read the whole thing. He knew the drill. It was all going to work out for him. It always did. "Looks good to me," Ronald said with a self-satisfied grin. He plucked a silver pen from Greg's desk and scrawled his signature with the kind of exaggerated flourish that only men who believe in their own invincibility possess. 1 page, 2 pages, 3. Each stroke of the pen felt like a victory. "Man, this is going to be big," Ronald said, shaking his head, still grinning. "I'm telling you, Greg, this is exactly the kind of move I've been waiting for." Greg smiled faintly, nodding. "That's what I told you, Ronald. Right place, right time. You're one of the lucky ones." He tapped the last page of the contract. "Last one right here." Ronald didn't hesitate. He pressed the pen to the page and signed with a flourish, leaning back in his chair like he just closed the deal of a lifetime. He slid the papers back toward Greg and smirked, tapping his fingers against the armrest. "Easy money," Ronald said, his grin so wide it looked carved into his face. "I'll be sipping cocktails by this time next year." Greg stacked the papers neatly, tapping them on the desk to align the edges. He glanced at Ronald for just a second too long, his face unreadable. Then he gave a slow, knowing nod. "Yeah," Greg said quietly, slipping the papers into a leather folder. "I'm sure you will." That evening, the soft glow of the kitchen pennant lights cast long, golden streaks across the marble countertops. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of fresh-baked bread. Mary moved slowly around the kitchen, stirring a pot of simmering sauce. Her movements were calm, methodical, the picture of domestic tranquility. Her face, however, was anything but peaceful. Her eyes stayed sharp, her jaw set tight. The sound of Ronald's keys jingling at the front door made her pause for just a second. She glanced at the clock. 6:42 p.m., right on time. She stirred the sauce one more time before turning off the burner. "Mary, I'm home," Ronald called from the front door, his voice carrying through the hallway. "Kitchen," she called back, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Her voice was light but measured, like the calm before a thunderstorm. She turned, her eyes locked on the doorway as Ronald walked in, shrugging off his coat. His grin was wide, his eyes bright with excitement. "You will not believe the deal I just closed," he said, hanging his coat on the back of the chair. "We're set, Mary. I'm talking beachfront, first-class golden years kind of set." He clapped his hands together like it was already done. "All those years of playing it safe. Worth it." Mary tilted her head, offering a soft smile. "That's wonderful, Ronald," she said, her voice gentle but just a touch too controlled. "But before we celebrate, I need you to look at something." He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" She reached behind the counter and pulled out a manila folder, its edges perfectly creased. Her eyes stayed on him as she walked slowly toward the dining table, laying the folder down with the precision of someone setting a final chess piece in place. She gestured for him to sit. Ronald chuckled, his grin faltering just a little. "All right, what's all this?" he asked, settling into a chair. "Just a few documents I think you'll want to see," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. Her eyes stayed on him, unblinking, unwavering. "Go ahead, open it." He glanced at her, his grin gone now, replaced with something closer to suspicion. But he did as she asked. He opened the folder. His eyes scanned the first page, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. "Bankruptcy proceedings," he muttered, squinting at the page. "What the hell is this?" "Keep reading," Mary said, her voice like ice water over flame. His eyes darted to the second page. Notice of liquidation of assets. His breath grew shallow. She flipped to the third. Total account balance, $0. His fingers gripped the paper harder now, his eyes wild, scanning every line. "No, no, no," he muttered, his head shaking. "This is a mistake." He looked up at Mary, eyes blazing with confusion and rage. "What did you do?" Her face didn't change. Calm, cold, she leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. "I didn't do anything, Ronald," she said softly. "You did. You signed it all away. Every penny." His eyes narrowed, his lips twisting into a snarl. "You think this is funny, Mary?" He shoved the papers toward her. "These are fake. You think you're cute, huh?" He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're right," Mary said, standing slowly, her gaze still on him. "They're fake. But the bank balance." She tilted her head. "That's real." Her words hung in the air like a fog that wouldn't clear. His breathing grew heavier, his face turning red. "Ruth," Mary called out, her voice echoing through the house. Ronald froze, his eyes darting toward the living room as the sound of heels echoed on the hardwood. And there she was, Ruth, red blazer, perfect posture. Her grin was slow, deliberate. She stepped into the kitchen, her eyes on Ronald the entire time. "Hey, darling," Ruth said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Did you miss me?" So his face went slack, eyes darting between Mary and Ruth like a trapped animal. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Mary's gaze sharpened, her eyes full of cold satisfaction. "You thought you had 2 women wrapped around your finger," she said, her voice deadly calm. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "Turns out we had you." The silence was absolute. No sound but the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. "Sit down, Ronald," Mary said, her voice sharp, final. "You're going to want to hear what happens next." He didn't move. "Sit." Her voice had the weight of a gavel. He sat. Mary leaned in close, her eyes never leaving his. "You took everything from me, Ronald. My trust. My security. 35 years. Her voice was calm, quiet, but it cut deeper than any scream. "Now, I'm taking it all back." Her eyes didn't flinch, neither did her voice. Just like that, Ronald finally understood he'd already lost. A few months later, the rain came down in slow, steady sheets, tapping softly against the large bay window of the living room. Drops slid down the glass like tiny rivers, distorting the view of the street outside. The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace but from absence. No footsteps, no voices, no faint hum of sports commentary from the television. Just the gentle patter of rain and the faint ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Mary stood by the window, a mug of chamomile tea cradled in her hands. The warmth seeped into her palms, grounding her. Her eyes tracked a lone figure on the sidewalk, moving slowly, shoulders hunched under the weight of it all. Ronald. His once pristine black coat was soaked through, clinging to him like a second skin. His head was down, his pace sluggish, every step heavier than last. His suitcase rolled behind him, the wheels struggling against the cracks in the pavement. Her eyes didn't waver, didn't blink. She watched him the way a hawk watches prey that's already too far gone to chase. He stopped at the edge of the driveway, his shoulders rising and falling with a long, weary breath. For a moment she thought he might turn around, look back, say something. But he didn't. He just kept walking, slowly, drenched and defeated. Mary took a sip of her tea, her eyes narrowing as he disappeared down the street. Her gaze stayed fixed on the spot where he'd vanished, the weight of it all finally settling into her chest. 35 years of loyalty. 35 years of patience, sacrifice, and belief in forever. Gone in an instant. Or maybe it hadn't been instant at all. Maybe it had been eroding bit by bit like a crack in a foundation no one noticed until it was too late. Her eyes drifted down to the envelope on the side table next to her. The bold black letters at the top read, "Finalized divorce decree." She'd signed it that morning, her signature clean, steady, and without hesitation. The paperwork included the deed to the house, her house now. No shared ownership, no splitting assets. It was hers alone. Her lips pressed into a firm, steady line, not a smile, not a frown, just quiet resolve. I built this life once. I'll build it again. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air, crisp and clean. The living room had been stripped down to its bones, furniture pushed to the center of the room, draped in white sheets. The old floral wallpaper, the one she'd let Ronald pick back in '98, was gone now. It had taken 2 full days, a steamer, and a lot of scraping, but she'd ripped it down with her own 2 hands. Mary stood at the edge of the room, hands on her hips, looking up at the newly painted walls. Soft, muted sage green, calm, earthy, mine. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She glanced at it, wiping her hands on her jeans as she walked over to check it. Message from Greg. Furniture delivery confirmed for tomorrow. Want me to swing by and help? Mary smiled to herself, tapping her reply. No need. I've got it covered. Her gaze swept across the room, her eyes landing on the space where the old brown leather recliner used to be. Ronald's throne. It had been there for years, a centerpiece of the room, and somehow it had always felt larger than it actually was, like it had claimed more space than it deserved. It was gone now. She'd had it picked up and donated, along with his sports memorabilia, his tacky golf trophies, and his stack of old vinyl records he'd promised to digitize someday. In its place, there would be a plush cream-colored armchair, comfortable, soft, inviting. It would face the window, not the television. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was from Ruth. Message from Ruth. New look for a new era. You always did have better taste than him. Mary snorted a short, quiet laugh, shaking her head. She typed back. About time I got to use it. She glanced around the room once more. It wasn't finished, but it was close. The walls were hers. The space was hers. Finally. 2 weeks later, the community center buzzed with quiet energy. Rows of folding chairs lined the room, and women of all ages, from their 30s to their 70s, sat in quiet attention. Their faces were marked with a mix of uncertainty and quiet determination. A few were dressed in work uniforms, some in casual clothes, others still in their business attire. At the front of the room, Mary stood next to a large whiteboard with the words "Financial Independence" for women written in bold blue marker. Her blouse was simple but elegant, her hair pulled back, just enough to frame her face. She was calm, poised, not the woman she used to be. All right, she said, her voice carrying just enough weight to command attention. Let's start with the basics. She clicked a marker open and underlined the words "Financial Independence." The first thing you need to understand is that every dollar you save is a choice. It's a choice to prioritize yourself, to protect yourself, and to prepare for any unexpected curveballs life throws at you. Her eyes scanned the room, stopping on a woman in the back, a woman who was gripping her notebook like it was a lifeline. Mary knew that look. She'd lived that look. The woman nodded slowly, her lips pressed together like she was holding something in. Anger, pain, determination? Mary's gaze softened. She knew what it felt like to sit in that chair, to be quiet, to feel like you had nothing left. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her. Some of you are here because you've been through something you didn't see coming, she said, her voice low but steady. Some of you are here because you don't want to wait for it to happen. Her eyes moved from face to face, pausing just long enough on each woman to let them know she saw them. But here's the truth, Mary continued, her voice sharper now, like a blade drawn from its sheath. No one is coming to save you. No one is going to hand you control. You have to take it. And she tapped the whiteboard, circling the words "Financial Independence" with a firm, deliberate motion. And the good news. You're all here because you're ready to do just that. A soft murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Women sat up straighter, Pens clicked open. Notebooks were ready. Mary smiled just a little, not wide, not loud, just enough. Back at home, the rain had stopped, and the world smelled fresh and clean. Mary stood at the edge of her freshly planted garden, hands in the soil, dirt under her nails. Her garden gloves lay forgotten on the stone path. The soil was soft and damp, perfect for planting. She pressed the roots of a new hydrangea bush into the earth, packing the dirt around it, firm but gentle. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not frantic. The sun peeked through the clouds, warming the back of her neck. Her breath was slow and even. For once, there was no clock to race against, no storm on the horizon, no one waiting for her to finish up. It was just her hands, her soil, her home. As she sat back on her heels, wiping a streak of dirt across her cheek, she glanced toward the empty driveway. No suitcase, no footsteps, no him. Her eyes turned toward the house. New paint, new furniture, new life. Betrayal can shatter trust, Mary said softly, brushing the dirt from her hands. Her gaze lifted to the sky, her eyes clear, steady, but it can also ignite strength. She pressed her hands into the dirt again, firm and certain. At the end of one chapter, she murmured to herself, pressing the roots deeper into the earth, is just the beginning of a better story.